"I will accept your bargain," she said, "but we are not merely searching for stolen grain. We are searching for the reason Lord Halstead needed to marry me before he could destroy me." The words had scarcely left Eleanor's mouth when Mr. Rook twisted violently against the footman holding him and shouted toward the church nave, "Do not believe her. She has ruined them all." His voice carried beyond the vestry, and the waiting congregation erupted into frightened whispers. Gideon ordered the doors closed, then placed the scorched confession inside the leather dispatch case he carried beneath his coat. "No one touches this without my permission," he said. "Not even you, Lady Eleanor." She disliked the warning, but respected the precaution. The fragment was now evidence, and evidence survived only when its custody could be proven. Sir Rowland demanded that Rook be taken before a magistrate, but the solicitor laughed as the Duke's servants searched him. He carried no letters from Halstead, no keys, and no money beyond a few ordinary coins. Even the red sealing wax had disappeared. "You have nothing," Rook said as he was led away. "A damaged confession proves only that a frightened bride refused to admit what she had done." Eleanor watched him go and understood that his attempted escape had been calculated. He had created a spectacle before 200 witnesses, ensuring that by nightfall, London would remember his accusation more clearly than her answer. Gideon seemed to reach the same conclusion. "Your reputation is already being buried," he said. "Then we had better uncover the grain before they finish digging." Eleanor removed her veil and laid it across the chair where the solicitor had asked her to surrender her name. She left the church through the main doors rather than the side entrance Halstead had offered her. The guests separated as she approached. Some looked embarrassed, some curious, and others openly pleased to witness a humiliation they would repeat over dinner. Eleanor walked between them with the Duke beside her, neither sheltered by his arm nor hidden behind his authority. Outside, instead of entering her family carriage, she climbed into Gideon's unmarked coach. Sir Rowland protested, but Eleanor sent him to Belgrave Square with instructions to remain beside her father and allow no one access to the Vale account books. During the journey to the river, Gideon sat opposite her and questioned her without mercy. He wanted to know when she first began working for Vale and Company, who had taught her the cipher, and why a merchant trusted his daughter with transactions many men would have hidden even from their sons. Eleanor answered plainly. Her mother had died when she was 12. Her father, Nathaniel Vale, had often been forced to bring her to the counting house because there was no one else to supervise her. At first, she had sharpened quills and sorted invoices. Later, she had discovered an error in a cargo insurance calculation that saved the company £400. Nathaniel began teaching her double-entry bookkeeping, foreign currencies, tides, cargo weights, and the private marks captains used when they feared their letters might be opened. By 16, she could estimate a ship's load from the depth of its hull in the water. By 19, she was negotiating insurance rates through a male clerk who received public credit for her work. Halstead had known all of it. He had praised her cleverness in private while insisting she hide it in society. "And you intended to marry such a man?" Gideon asked. "I intended to marry the man he pretended to be." Something unreadable crossed the Duke's face, but he offered no comfort. The Vale counting house stood near Wapping, its doors sealed with a notice from the Crown Grain Office. 2 guards blocked the entrance until Gideon showed his authority. Inside, the familiar rooms felt like the remains of a life interrupted. Desks had been forced open, papers scattered, and account books piled carelessly across the floor. Eleanor went directly to a narrow storage chamber beneath the rear staircase. No investigator would consider it important. It held broken scales, outdated harbor charts, and rotting wooden boxes. Yet it was there that she and her father had kept duplicate cargo figures, hidden inside the covers of old tide tables, precisely because thieves searched strong boxes first. A voice came from the darkness. "I knew you would come here." Eleanor turned to find Thomas Bell, her father's 17-year-old junior clerk, curled behind a stack of crates with a bruised cheek and dried blood on his collar. He had worked for the company for only 9 months, supporting a widowed mother and 2 younger sisters, but he had refused to abandon the building when the officers arrived. Thomas explained that Rook had come shortly before dawn with 4 men. They removed the current tide register, 3 captains' receipt books, and the brass plate used to stamp Vale shipping orders. When Thomas tried to stop them, they struck him and threatened to accuse him of participating in the fraud. Gideon asked why he had remained. Lady Eleanor taught me figures when no other clerk would, the boy replied. I could not let them take everything belonging to her father. Eleanor found the duplicate tide tables untouched, but Thomas's family would be endangered if his testimony became known. Gideon wanted to bring him immediately before the royal investigators. Eleanor refused. Instead, she removed the pearl necklace intended for her wedding breakfast and gave it to Thomas with instructions to move his mother and sisters to her aunt's house in Richmond before nightfall. The pearls were the last valuable property she possessed that had not been included in the stolen dowry. You are paying a witness, Gideon said after the boy departed. I am protecting a family. Record the necklace in writing so no one can claim otherwise. For the first time, the Duke looked at her with something other than suspicion. Together, they opened the oldest tide table. A folded copy of the missing cargo list remained sewn inside its spine. Eleanor compared the dates, vessel names, declared weights, and departure times. The official records stated that the largest ship, the Mercy Jane, had sailed from London at 4 o'clock on the morning of March 7th carrying 800 sacks of grain. But the duplicate harbor measurement recorded her hull sitting 6 feet higher in the water, less than an hour before departure. Eleanor ran her finger beneath the figures. She was nearly empty. Gideon leaned closer. Then where was the grain? Eleanor turned to the next entry and felt the room grow cold. All 3 missing ships had supposedly departed fully loaded, yet every hull measurement showed the same impossible lack of weight. The grain had never been placed aboard them at all. Someone had forged an entire voyage to make the Crown search across the Channel, while thousands of sacks remained hidden somewhere in England. Then Eleanor noticed the final notation beside the Mercy Jane, a warehouse code belonging to land owned not by Lord Halstead, but by the Duke of Ashbourne himself. For several seconds, neither Eleanor nor Gideon spoke. The warehouse code, A17, had been written beside the Mercy Jane in Nathaniel Vale's private hand, but a second line had been added in darker ink. Blackwood Quay, Storehouse 4. Gideon took the tide table from her and examined it beneath the window. That building belongs to my estate, but it has stood empty for 3 years. Who controls access? Eleanor asked. My London agent. Name? Edmund Vane. The answer came too quickly, sharpened by disbelief rather than hesitation. Vane had served the Blackwood family for 12 years and managed Gideon's wharves, rents, and commercial leases, while the Duke divided his time between Parliament and his northern estates. Gideon insisted the man had no authority to store Crown grain without written permission, but Eleanor pointed to the code again. Then either someone forged your agent's authority, or Mr. Vane has used your confidence as a key. Gideon's expression closed. We will ask him. If you summon him now, Storehouse 4 will be empty when we arrive. He disliked being corrected. She saw it in the tightening of his jaw. Yet after one glance at the feathered ink, the impossible hull measurements, and the warehouse code tied to his own property, he ordered his carriage brought around without sending word ahead. They left the counting house by the rear door, taking only the duplicate tide table and the scorched confession. Gideon placed both inside his dispatch case, locked it, and retained the key. Eleanor approved without saying so. Blackwood Quay lay farther east along the Thames, beyond the fashionable streets and crowded markets, where the air tasted of coal smoke, tar, fish, and river mud. Storehouse 4 stood at the end of a narrow lane behind a rusted iron gate. Its windows had been boarded, its painted number nearly erased, and a heavy chain hung across the front doors. To an ordinary observer, it appeared abandoned. Eleanor noticed fresh wheel ruts in the mud, grains of wheat trapped beneath the chain, and a narrow strip of clean iron where the lock had repeatedly rubbed against the gate. Someone used this entrance last night, she said. Gideon crouched beside the wheel tracks. How can you know when? It rained shortly before dawn. The water collected inside the ruts rather than softening their edges. The cart passed after the rain stopped. Gideon looked toward the silent warehouse. You see a great deal. I was trained to notice what costs money. The lock opened with the Duke's estate key. Inside, darkness swallowed them. Gideon's footmen lit lanterns, revealing an enormous room apparently filled with broken pallets, rotting barrels, and discarded rope. There was no grain. Gideon said nothing, but Eleanor felt his earlier suspicion returning. The official searchers would have looked once, seen the empty floor, and left. She walked slowly along the nearest wall. counting her steps, then examined the ceiling beams and the placement of the supporting columns. Storehouse 4 appeared 30 yards long from outside, but its interior measured no more than 24. 6 yards had vanished. At the rear stood a row of empty barrels stacked to the ceiling. Eleanor pressed her hand against one. It was too clean. "These have not been abandoned," she said. "They were placed here to hide something." The footmen removed the barrels and uncovered a recently constructed wooden partition painted to resemble the original wall. Gideon found no handle or visible hinge, but Eleanor studied the floor. One board beneath the partition was polished by repeated pressure. She stepped on it. A concealed counterweight shifted, and part of the wall swung inward. The smell reached them first: warm wheat, damp canvas, and the sour beginning of mold. Behind the partition, hundreds of sacks were stacked almost to the rafters. Eleanor entered with a lantern and counted the rows, calculating their depth and height. 960 sacks in this chamber. If the adjoining section is the same size, nearly 2,000. Gideon cut open the nearest sack. Golden grain spilled across his glove. The crown's blue procurement mark had been scraped from the canvas, but traces of pigment remained in the seams. This was not all 3,000 sacks, yet it was enough to feed several northern villages through the worst weeks of winter. Gideon immediately ordered one footman to bring royal guards, and another to find carts. Eleanor stopped him before he left. The grain near the outer wall was damp, and several sacks had already begun heating at their centers. If they were loaded carelessly or left piled together overnight, the moisture would spread and ruin the entire store. She directed the men to open the roof vents, separate the affected sacks, lay dry sailcloth across the floor, and move the sound grain in alternating rows so air could pass between them. Gideon followed her instructions without argument. Within an hour, 40 laborers from the neighboring quays had been hired, and Eleanor organized them into teams for counting, inspection, and removal. She marked every 10th sack with chalk, created duplicate tallies, and required 2 men from different teams to sign each cart record. By sunset, 800 usable sacks had been secured for immediate shipment north, while 160 damp sacks were spread for drying instead of being lost. No one praised her. There was no time. Yet Gideon stood beside the loading doors, watching a system that had begun in confusion move with steady precision under her direction. When Edmund Vane finally arrived, he appeared astonished to find the warehouse open. He was a narrow-faced man of 40, with silver at his temples and immaculate gloves despite the mud outside. "Your Grace," he said, "I came as soon as I heard strangers had entered Blackwood property." Eleanor noticed that he did not ask what they had found. Gideon demanded the lease records for Storehouse 4. Vane claimed the building had not been leased since its closure and suggested smugglers must have copied the estate key. Then smugglers knew the private code used in the Vale Tide registers, Eleanor said. Vane looked at her for the first time. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by contempt carefully disguised as sympathy. "Lady Eleanor, I had heard of your unfortunate mourning. The information had traveled quickly, but not that quickly. The church was several miles away, and Vane claimed to have come directly from his office after learning of the intrusion. He should not yet have known she had been abandoned." Eleanor said nothing. Vane walked among the sacks, touching none of them. When he departed to retrieve the supposed lease books, a dock laborer found a small copper token caught in the torn seam of one sack and handed it to Eleanor. One side bore the number 17. The other carried a winged serpent identical to the image pressed into the red wax on Rook's confession. A triangular notch had been cut into its edge. Eleanor showed it to Gideon, but did not clean it or rub away the grain dust embedded in the design. He wrapped it in a square of unused paper, wrote the location, time, and names of those present across the fold, then sealed it inside his dispatch case. From the open loading door, Eleanor saw Vane standing at the far end of the quay, speaking to a man in a gray coat. The stranger looked directly at her before disappearing into the fog. Moments later, one of the workers called from behind the false wall. He had found a second chamber, but it contained no grain. Only hundreds of empty sacks, each newly marked with the name of a village on Gideon's northern estates. Eleanor examined the list and understood the purpose. Whoever controlled the grain had never intended merely to steal it. They meant to create records showing that the food had reached the north, while the villages starved and the Duke of Ashbourne received the blame. The empty sacks bore the names of 14 villages, including Greyhaven, the largest settlement on Gideon's Northumberland estate. Eleanor compared the markings against the Duke's distribution schedule and found that every village chosen lay along the same winter road, a route frequently blocked by snow. If the grain failed to arrive, weeks might pass before anyone in London discovered the deception. By then, hunger would have become unrest, and unrest could be described as rebellion. Gideon ordered the false sacks preserved and assigned 2 armed men to guard the warehouse through the night. Before Eleanor could explain the full pattern to the royal officers, Edmund Vane returned with a leather portfolio and 3 officials from the Crown Grain Office. He entered Storehouse 4 as though he were bringing them to a discovery of his own. "Thank heaven we arrived in time," he announced. "I became suspicious of irregular activity on the Duke's quay and alerted His Grace this afternoon." Eleanor looked at Gideon. His face remained unreadable. Vane presented a lease bearing the name of a bankrupt cooper named Josiah Crane, claiming Crane must have lent the warehouse to smugglers without the estate's knowledge. The document appeared properly witnessed and carried Gideon's commercial seal. Sir Matthew Clore, the senior grain commissioner, praised Vane for his vigilance and congratulated the Duke on recovering 800 sacks. Eleanor's count had become 800 because the damaged grain was omitted, and her discovery of the false wall was not mentioned at all. When she attempted to correct the record, Clore regarded her with open distaste. "Lady Eleanor, your connection to these missing shipments is already under examination. It would be inappropriate for us to accept evidence from you until your own conduct has been cleared." "The grain would still be behind that wall if not for her," Gideon said. Clore lowered his voice. "Your Grace, London is saying she arranged this entire display to gain your protection after Lord Halstead abandoned her. I advise caution before you attach the Blackwood name to hers." The warning was quiet, but Eleanor heard every word. So did the laborers nearest the door. By morning, the story would be repeated as fact. The disgraced bride had invented a conspiracy to ensnare a duke. Gideon could have ended the insult by revealing Thomas Bell's testimony, but Eleanor met his eyes and gave a slight shake of her head. Thomas and his family had not yet reached Richmond. If Vane learned the boy had seen him at the counting house, the pearl necklace would not protect them from a knife on a dark road. Gideon understood and remained silent, though that silence cost Eleanor the credit for everything she had accomplished. Vane then explained how he had supposedly identified the hidden chamber. He claimed that a damaged board in the false wall had allowed grain to spill onto the warehouse floor. Gideon walked to the partition and examined it. No board was damaged. The only spilled grain lay near the front door, where Eleanor had first found it beneath the chain. "Which opening did you see?" he asked. Vane pointed vaguely toward the center. "It may have been repaired before I arrived." "By men who were loading carts under armed observation?" Vane's confidence faltered. "I can only report what I observed." Gideon did not accuse him, but Eleanor saw the change in his gaze. Suspicion had become attention, and attention was far more dangerous to a liar. Sir Matthew ordered the recovered grain transported to a Crown depot rather than sent directly north. Eleanor objected. The villages named on the false sacks had perhaps 10 days of food remaining, while the depot's inspection process could delay release for 3 weeks. Clore dismissed her calculation and insisted regulations must be followed. Gideon had authority over his own carts, but not over grain purchased by the Crown. Eleanor therefore examined the original procurement agreement, which Sir Matthew carried in his portfolio. A clause on the 6th page allowed any supplier to replace compromised goods at his own expense before final inspection. Vale and Company remained the named supplier, despite the government's attempt to seize its records. Eleanor proposed that the 800 sound sacks be formally returned to her father's company as compromised stock. She would then resell the same grain to Gideon for 1 shilling, allowing him to distribute it privately to his tenants without waiting for the Crown. The transaction would cost Vale and Company nearly £4,000 in unpaid government funds. It might also destroy the last chance of saving her father's business. "You would surrender the payment?" Gideon asked. "The grain was purchased to feed people, not to protect our balance sheet. Your creditors may take the company. Then they will take it after the villages have eaten." Sir Matthew called the proposal irregular, but it was legal, and Gideon forced him to acknowledge the clause before witnesses. Eleanor signed the transfer with her uninjured hand. The burned lace on her other glove had stiffened against her palm, and the skin beneath it throbbed. but she refused to let anyone see. By nightfall, the first 40 carts were traveling north under Blackwood guards. The measurable result was written in Gideon's own hand. 800 sacks recovered, 784 fit for immediate use, 16 reserved for drying and inspection, 14 villages supplied for 12 additional days. Vane's account of events contained none of those numbers. When Gideon asked him how many sacks had been found, he answered, approximately 1,000. It was the answer of a man who had never counted them. As the royal officers departed, Gideon approached Eleanor beside the loading doors. Clore credited Vane because Vane is a gentleman with an office, while you are a woman standing in a ruined wedding dress. That is how official truth is often made. Does it not anger you? It angers me enough to remember every detail. His eyes dropped to her hand. Blood had seeped through the scorched glove. Without asking permission, he removed a clean handkerchief from his pocket and held it out. He did not touch her. The restraint mattered more than courtesy would have. Eleanor accepted the cloth and wrapped her palm. You sacrificed 4,000 pounds to feed people who may never know your name, he said. Do not mistake necessity for sainthood. I do not. Something warmer than praise passed through his expression. Respect stripped of condescension. And for one dangerous moment, Eleanor became aware of how close they stood, amid the lantern light and drifting grain dust. Then a guard summoned Gideon to inspect the final cart, and the moment dissolved. Eleanor returned to Belgrave Square shortly before midnight. Her father had not been arrested, but 2 crown officers remained outside the house, and every servant had heard the rumors. In her bedroom, drawers stood open, and her writing desk had been searched. Nothing valuable was missing. On the pillow lay the wedding veil she had left at the church. Someone had cut it cleanly from top to bottom. Pinned to the torn lace was a strip of paper bearing the winged serpent in red wax. Beneath it, in the private cipher known only to Eleanor, her father, and Halstead, were 7 words: withdraw your evidence, or Thomas Bell dies first. Eleanor did not touch the torn veil. She locked the bedroom door, summoned Sir Rowland and the housekeeper, Mrs. Mercer, and required both to witness the message exactly where it had been left. Only after they had observed the cut lace, the pin, and the unbroken red wax did she lift the paper with a pair of silver sugar tongs. She placed it inside a clean envelope, wrote the time and names of the witnesses across the flap, and sealed it with her personal signet. Then she sent a servant to Ashbourne House carrying a note that mentioned neither Thomas nor Richmond. If the messenger was intercepted, the conspirators would learn nothing. Gideon arrived less than an hour later with 2 armed footmen. He examined the threat beneath the library lamps and compared its wax impression with the copper token from Storehouse 4. The serpent's wings, raised tail, and crown-shaped tongue matched, but the threat lacked the triangular notch cut into the token's edge. The token may identify a particular warehouse or member, Eleanor said. 17 could be a location, a shipment, or a man. Gideon asked who knew Thomas had helped them. Eleanor named everyone present at the counting house: herself, Gideon, Sir Rowland, the 2 crown guards, and whoever had searched the offices earlier. The list was small enough to be useful and large enough to be dangerous. Gideon immediately sent 4 trusted riders toward Richmond by separate roads, ordering them to locate Thomas without approaching Eleanor's aunt's house openly. He also insisted that Eleanor leave Belgrave Square and remain at Ashbourne House under his protection. If I disappear into your home the night after my wedding scandal, London will say I arranged Halstead's departure to become your mistress. London may say what it pleases. A duke can afford that philosophy. A merchant's daughter cannot. Gideon's mouth hardened. And a dead woman has no reputation left to defend. Eleanor could not dispute the threat hidden in her room. She agreed to move at dawn, but only after ensuring her father would accompany her. Nathaniel Vale had spent the day confined to his bed after suffering pain in his chest, and the physician warned that any further shock might kill him. Gideon arranged a guarded carriage and sent his own doctor ahead. Eleanor remained in the library through the night, reconstructing the stolen shipments from memory while Mrs. Mercer packed her clothes. Shortly before sunrise, Gideon's riders returned with troubling news. Thomas, his mother, and his sisters had reached Richmond safely, but the boy had disappeared from the house before midnight. He had left no letter. Eleanor refused to believe he had fled voluntarily. Thomas knew the roads poorly, possessed little money, and would never abandon the family he worked to support. The threat had not predicted his death. It had announced that the conspirators already knew where he was. At 6 o'clock, heavy fists struck the front door. Sir Matthew Clore entered with officers from the Crown Grain Office, and a warrant issued in Eleanor's name. Edmund Vane followed behind him, carrying a locked wooden chest. He claimed the chest had been discovered inside Storehouse 4 after Gideon departed. The lock bore Eleanor's initials. When Clore opened it, the room fell silent. Inside lay the missing brass stamping plate from Vale and Company, 12 blank shipping orders already marked with Eleanor's signature, 3 bags of Crown sovereigns, a bottle of red sealing wax, and a ledger recording payments to dock laborers. Thomas Bell's name appeared on nearly every page. "This is absurd," Sir Rowland said. "Anyone could have placed those things inside." Vane produced 2 warehouse guards who swore they had seen Eleanor carrying the chest through Blackwood Quay shortly before Gideon arrived. Their description of her wedding dress, burned glove, and pearl necklace was exact. Eleanor understood how the lie had been built. Many workers had seen her at the quay, and Thomas had been given the pearls in front of Gideon. Every innocent act had been reshaped into evidence of conspiracy. Sir Matthew opened the forged ledger to its final entry. It stated that Eleanor had paid Thomas £50 to hide the grain, and another 20 to burn the original manifests. "Where is the boy?" he demanded. "Under your protection, I believe. He has been abducted. Or rewarded." Clore ordered the officers to search Belgrave Square. They entered Eleanor's father's study and returned carrying a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon. Each letter appeared to be written by Lord Halstead and described a plan between him and Eleanor to divert Crown grain, create unrest on Ashbourne lands, and profit when prices rose. The final letter promised that Halstead would abandon her publicly so she could gain Gideon's confidence. Eleanor recognized her former fiancé's handwriting, but the words were too perfect. They explained every event, implicated every convenient person, and left Edmund Vane appearing as the faithful servant who discovered the fraud. "Halstead would never preserve letters proving his own treason," she said. "A criminal may be vain," Clore replied, "or a rejected woman may retain what she should have destroyed." Gideon read the letters one by one. Eleanor waited for him to point out the contradictions, but the letters contained details only a trusted person could know: the northern route, the Vale cipher, the false hull measurements, and even the private conversation in which Eleanor had agreed to help find the ships. Someone had observed them far more closely than they realized. Gideon finally turned to her. "Did you ever discuss my northern distribution schedule with Halstead?" "Once, months ago. He asked which estates purchased Vale grain." "Did you tell him the roads used?" "I showed him a map." The admission changed something in Gideon's face. His late wife had betrayed him. Eleanor knew only the bare rumor, not the details, and now the evidence before him had been designed to strike precisely at that old wound. He did not declare her guilty, but neither did he order Clore away. "Until these documents are examined, Lady Eleanor will remain at Ashbourne House under guard," he said. "She will surrender her correspondence and have no unsupervised contact with witnesses." The decision protected her from a public prison, yet it also placed her under his authority as a suspect. Eleanor felt the fragile respect between them break with almost physical force. "You offered me a bargain," she said quietly, "not a cage. I am trying to keep you alive, while deciding whether I deserve to be free." Gideon had no answer. As the officers gathered the evidence, Eleanor studied the forged payment ledger. The entries were careful, but one date drew her attention. Thomas had supposedly received money for burning the original manifests on March 9th. Beside the payment was the notation, "After North Road confirmation." The phrase made no sense if it referred to a past shipment. Then she remembered the carts carrying the recovered grain toward Gideon's villages. They were traveling along North Road now. The false accusation was not merely intended to imprison her. It was designed to occupy Gideon and the Crown, while someone intercepted the only grain those villages had left. Eleanor looked toward the clock. The carts had departed 7 hours earlier. By dawn, they would reach Calder Bridge, the narrowest and most isolated point on the entire northern route. "Your Grace," she said, the anger between them suddenly less urgent than the danger, "if you keep questioning me until morning, there will be no witnesses left to prove either of us innocent." They are going to take the grain at Calder Bridge tonight, and kill every Blackwood guard traveling with it. Sir Matthew Clore dismissed the warning before Eleanor finished explaining it. Calder Bridge is guarded by the Duke's own men. No criminal band would attack 40 carts protected by armed riders. They do not need to defeat the guards, Eleanor replied. They need only present an order bearing the Blackwood seal. Gideon looked toward Edmund Vane, but the estate agent displayed convincing outrage. Lady Eleanor now accuses the entire Blackwood household because evidence has exposed her own crimes. Clore ordered the officers to take Eleanor upstairs and prevent her from communicating with anyone. Gideon stepped between them. She is not going upstairs. Your Grace, the warrant permits confinement. In my house, under my authority. If you remove her while she is under investigation, Parliament will hear that you obstructed the Crown to protect a woman accused of stealing royal grain. Gideon's gaze remained fixed on Eleanor. She could see the battle between what he feared and what the evidence demanded. His late wife's betrayal had taught him to distrust intimacy. The forged letters had transformed that wound into a weapon. Yet the warning in the false ledger contained information Eleanor could not have invented after the carts departed. Finally, Gideon removed the Blackwood signet from his finger and placed it upon the table. Record that I am assuming personal responsibility for Lady Eleanor Vale. If she attempts escape, destroys evidence, or proves complicit in an attack on my men, I will surrender my seat on the Royal Provisioning Committee and answer before the Lords. Sir Matthew stared at the ring. You would risk your office for her? I am risking it for 800 sacks of grain and 14 villages. She happens to be the only person in this room who has been correct more than once today. He ordered 6 horses prepared and sent a rider ahead to the coaching station at Highgate to arrange fresh mounts. Eleanor changed from her damaged wedding dress into a dark traveling habit borrowed from Gideon's widowed sister. They left London before 8 o'clock, carrying the duplicate tide table, the forged ledger, and Gideon's dispatch case. Clore refused to provide Crown officers, and Vane claimed illness prevented him from riding. That refusal confirmed Eleanor's suspicion more strongly than any confession. Rain began as they passed Highgate, turning the northern road into black mud. Gideon set a punishing pace. Eleanor had ridden since childhood, but never for such distance at night. Her burned palm reopened against the reins, and cold water soaked through her gloves. Gideon noticed, but did not ask her to stop. Pity would have angered her. His silent respect did not. At the first coaching station, they learned that the grain convoy had passed 3 hours earlier. At the second, the stable master reported that a gentleman carrying a Blackwood order had overtaken it with instructions to halt at Calder Bridge for inspection. The order bore Gideon's seal. What did the messenger look like? Eleanor asked. The stable master described a man in a gray coat, the same man she had seen speaking with Vane at the quay. Gideon sent 2 footmen ahead, while the others continued with them. Near midnight, one rider returned with blood on his sleeve. He had found the rear guard from the convoy lying beside the road with a fractured skull. The man was alive but unconscious. The carts had turned east 2 miles before the bridge, following an old toll road toward Calder Mill. Gideon knew no reason for such a diversion. Eleanor did. Vale and Company had once used Calder Mill to transfer imported grain from wagons to river barges when the northern roads became impassable. The mill had been abandoned after a flood changed the river channel, but its granary could hold more than 1,000 sacks. They are not planning to seize the carts at the bridge, she said. The bridge was merely the instruction that made the convoy trust the messenger. They are taking the grain to the mill. To hide it again? No. The mill stands above the workers' settlement at Calder Hollow. If the grain is burned there, the fire will spread downhill through the cottages. Gideon's face went still. Why burn grain worth a fortune? Because dead villagers and destroyed crown supplies create a greater scandal than stolen sacks. The forged ledger will show that I paid Thomas to start the fire. Your seal placed the convoy at the mill. They will blame us both. As they approached Calder Hollow, an orange glow appeared beyond the trees. For one terrible moment, Eleanor believed they were too late, but the light came from lanterns surrounding the mill yard rather than flames. The grain carts stood in 2 rows inside the locked gates. Most of Gideon's guards had been disarmed and bound beneath the loading awning. At least 20 men in laborers' coats moved between the carts, pouring liquid from barrels onto the wheels and canvas covers. Even in the rain, Eleanor smelled lamp oil. A second group carried bundles of straw into the mill. The attackers intended the fire to appear accidental, an overturned lantern igniting dry grain dust, while the soaked wheels prevented the carts from being pulled away. Gideon counted their own force, 4 able footmen, himself, and Eleanor, against more than 20 armed men. The nearest magistrate was 12 miles away. By the time help arrived, the mill, the grain, and Calder Hollow would be ashes. Gideon wanted to charge the gate and release his guards, but Eleanor stopped him. A direct attack would cause the conspirators to ignite the oil immediately. She studied the mill, the yard, and the dark line of the abandoned river channel. Though the flood had moved the main current years earlier, recent rain had filled the old channel to within several feet of the mill's lower wall. A wooden sluice gate still held the water back. Her father had once explained that the miller used the gate to control the wheel race. If opened completely, the old channel would flood the yard, not deeply enough to drown anyone, but enough to extinguish the oil and trap the heavy grain carts in mud. The sluice mechanism is inside the mill, Gideon said. Then someone must enter without being seen. Eleanor pointed to the narrow stone drainage tunnel beneath the eastern wall. It was barely large enough for a person to crawl through, and the rising water would fill it within an hour. I can reach the wheel chamber through there. No. Your men cannot fit, and you cannot command them if you go. You are under my protection. Your protection will mean very little to the people in those cottages when the hill catches fire. A shout came from the yard. One of the attackers had dragged a bound prisoner into the lantern light. It was Thomas Bell. His face was swollen, and a rope circled his neck. The man in the gray coat held up a red sealed order and announced that the boy would confess before the fire began. Eleanor understood why Thomas had disappeared from Richmond. The conspirators needed a living witness long enough to authenticate the lie, then a dead culprit who could never retract it. Gideon looked from Thomas to the drainage tunnel. Trusting Eleanor's plan meant allowing the woman he had publicly accepted as his prisoner to disappear beneath an enemy-held building, with evidence capable of destroying them both. He drew a small pistol from inside his coat and placed it in her uninjured hand. "Open the sluice," he said. "When the water reaches the first cart, I will attack the gate and free the guards." He then turned to his men. "If Lady Eleanor does not return, every consequence is mine." Eleanor lowered herself into the freezing channel. Behind her, Gideon and the footmen vanished into the trees to take their positions. Ahead, black water moved through the stone tunnel, rising steadily toward its roof. She drew one breath, gripped the pistol above the surface, and began crawling toward the mill, while, in the yard beyond the wall, the man in gray struck a match. The match flared in the gray-coated man's hand, as Eleanor forced herself deeper into the drainage tunnel. The water reached her shoulders, numbing her burned palm and dragging at the heavy folds of her riding habit. She held Gideon's pistol between her teeth and pulled herself forward by the rough stones. Behind her, the tunnel entrance vanished into darkness. Ahead, a thin line of lantern light appeared beneath an iron grate. Voices sounded above it. "Make the boy sign," the man in gray ordered. "When the roof catches, leave him beside the oil barrel." Thomas answered with a curse that earned him another blow. Eleanor reached the grate and pushed. It did not move. Rust had sealed the hinges, and the rising current pressed her against the bars. She searched blindly along the wall until her fingers found the old mill wheel's maintenance chain. Her father had once shown her a similar mechanism at a warehouse in Kent. The drainage grate and sluice counterweight were connected so a miller could clear debris without entering the water. Eleanor wrapped the chain around her wrist and pulled. Nothing happened. Above her, Thomas cried out. The smell of smoke entered the tunnel. She braced both boots against the stones and used her full weight. The chain shifted an inch, then another. Somewhere inside the wall, a counterweight groaned. The grate lifted, and Eleanor dragged herself into the wheel chamber just as freezing water rushed past her into the mill race. The sluice lever stood across the room, secured by a wooden pin. She pulled the pin free and threw her weight against the lever. The gate opened with a violent crack. Water exploded through the old channel beneath the mill, striking the yard in a widening black sheet. Men shouted. Lanterns toppled and vanished. Oil floated briefly across the flood before the current swept it away from the carts. Gideon's pistol sounded outside, followed by the crash of the main gate. Eleanor climbed the stairs into the loading room. 2 attackers ran toward her. She fired into the ceiling, showering them with splinters, then struck the nearer man across the face with the empty pistol. The second seized her injured wrist. Pain flashed up her arm, but before he could drag her toward the burning straw, Thomas threw himself against the man's knees. Eleanor tore free, grabbed the wooden sluice pin, and brought it down across the attacker's shoulder. Gideon entered a moment later, soaked by rain and floodwater, with 3 freed guards behind him. His gaze found Eleanor first. Only after seeing her standing did he turn toward the remaining attackers. The fight ended quickly once the Blackwood guards were armed. 11 men surrendered, 4 escaped into the trees, and the rest were pulled unconscious from the flooded yard. The man in gray cut Thomas's rope and attempted to use the boy as a shield, but Eleanor noticed the copper token hanging from his waistcoat. Its edge bore the same triangular notch as the token from Storehouse 4. "Gideon, his left pocket!" she shouted. The Duke understood without asking why. He struck the man's wrist as he reached inside his coat, sending a small pistol into the water. Thomas dropped to the ground, and Gideon drove the attacker against a cart. The man tore free, mounted a waiting horse, and escaped through the broken gate before the guards could close it. He left behind part of his coat and the copper token, still attached to its chain. Eleanor did not touch it. Gideon ordered 2 guards to witness its recovery, wrapped it separately, and recorded the location and condition exactly as he had done with the first. The grain remained intact. 3 canvas covers had burned, but the sacks beneath were only wet at their outer seams. Eleanor organized the villagers into drying teams, while Gideon treated the wounded and sent riders for the magistrate. Thomas was alive, though barely able to stand. He admitted that he had left Richmond after receiving a note supposedly written by Eleanor, asking him to bring the duplicate records to Calder Mill. The note used her cipher and mentioned the pearl necklace, convincing him it was genuine. Men seized him before he reached the mill. During the journey, he overheard them discussing the 17th share and a payment due after the northern villages rose against Gideon. One captor carried a packet of papers inside an oilskin pouch. Thomas had torn it from the man's belt during the flooding and hidden it beneath a grain cart. Eleanor and Gideon recovered the pouch in the presence of the magistrate's clerk. Inside lay a list of all 14 villages, the number of sacks supposedly delivered to each, and payments made to Edmund Vane through a foreign banking house in Calais. The paper carried the winged serpent, but no signature identified Lord Halstead. It was powerful evidence against Vane, yet still fragile. He could claim the papers were forged by Eleanor, just as she claimed the letters found at Belgrave Square were forged against her. The triangular notches on both copper tokens provided the stronger link. When placed together, the missing sections formed a narrow, diamond-shaped opening. Eleanor held them above the red wax seal on the threat. Through the opening, only one part of the serpent remained visible, the tiny crown forming its tongue. "They are accounting tallies," she said. "Each notched pair verifies that a payment and delivery belong to the same transaction. 17 is not a warehouse. It is a share in the conspiracy." Gideon looked at the list. 17 payments had been divided among 17 unnamed partners. Halstead and Vane were not stealing grain for themselves. They were organizing investors who would profit from rising prices after the northern shortages. The fire at Calder Mill would have destroyed the recovered supply, killed witnesses, and triggered the unrest required to increase that profit. Near dawn, when the wounded had been settled and the first grain sacks spread beneath dry village roofs, Gideon found Eleanor alone beside the silent mill wheel. He returned the pistol to its case and examined the bandage around her hand. "I believed those letters for longer than I should have," he said. "You believed a wound that had been carefully reopened. That explains my hesitation. It does not excuse putting you under guard." Eleanor looked toward the flooded yard. "No, it does not." He accepted the judgment without defending himself. Then, with visible effort, he told her the truth about his wife. Lydia had not merely taken a lover. She had forged Gideon's seal to sell military horses during the war, leaving an entire regiment without mounts. Vane had discovered the betrayal and helped conceal the scandal after Lydia died from fever. Gideon had rewarded him with absolute trust. "If Vane deceived me as well, then I built my household upon the man who taught me never to trust again." Eleanor understood the cruelty of that design, but she did not offer easy forgiveness. "Then we will prove what he did. Afterward, You must decide what kind of man you are without his fear guiding you." Gideon looked at her as though no one had ever spoken to him with such severity and such faith at once. He reached for her hand, stopped before touching it, and waited. Eleanor chose to place her uninjured fingers in his. His grip was warm, careful, and brief, yet something passed between them that no bargain had contained. A rider interrupted them before either could speak. One of the escaped attackers had been captured, but another had taken the fastest southern road. He carried a Blackwood relay token that would give him fresh horses at every estate station. By the time Eleanor and Gideon returned to London, the messenger would have reached Vane hours ahead of them. Their enemy now knew Thomas had survived, the grain had been saved, and the 2 matching copper tokens had revealed the existence of 17 conspirators. They left Calder Hollow shortly after sunrise, but the return to London took nearly the entire day, because Eleanor refused to abandon the wounded guards or leave Thomas unprotected. Gideon divided his men between the grain convoy and their carriage, placing the 2 copper tokens and the oilskin papers inside his locked dispatch case. At every coaching station, he changed both horses and drivers, yet the messenger, who had escaped the mill, remained several hours ahead. When Ashbourne House finally came into view after dark, its gates stood open and a crowd filled the street. Newspaper sellers shouted beneath the lamps, waving freshly printed sheets that named Eleanor the architect of the Calder Mill attack. One headline declared that the disgraced bride had seduced the Duke of Ashbourne into rescuing her accomplices. Another claimed Gideon had stolen crown grain to distribute among his own tenants in exchange for political loyalty. The details could only have come from someone who knew what had happened at the mill, but each truth had been reversed. Thomas's abduction became proof of his guilt. Eleanor's opening of the sluice became an attempt to wash away evidence. Gideon's defense of the carts became an armed obstruction of royal officers. Inside the house, Sir Matthew Clore waited with 6 constables and an emergency order from the Royal Provisioning Committee. Edmund Vane stood beside him. Vane's expression showed neither fear nor surprise at seeing Eleanor and Thomas alive. "Thank God you survived," he said to Gideon. "We feared Lady Eleanor had led you into an ambush." Gideon ordered him arrested. Clore refused. During their absence, Vane had produced bank records showing that the foreign payments in the oilskin packet came from an account opened in Eleanor's name. He had also found the metal die supposedly used to create the winged serpent tokens inside Nathaniel Vale's counting house. If the die was genuine, then Eleanor could have manufactured both tokens herself. "The die was planted," Eleanor said, "as were the letters, the chest, the gold, and every other piece of evidence that displeases you." Clore held out his hand for Gideon's dispatch case. "The committee has suspended your investigative authority. All evidence must be surrendered." Gideon refused until Clore produced a second order bearing the Prince Regent's delegated seal. To resist it would make him openly defiant of the crown. In the presence of 12 witnesses, Gideon unlocked the case and listed every object before transferring it. The scorched confession, the red wax threat, the duplicate tide table, the 2 copper tokens, the oilskin payment list, and the forged ledger from the chest. Clore's clerk recorded each item. Vane watched the tokens more closely than he watched anything else. The moment Clore sealed the evidence box, every lamp in the entrance hall went dark. Glass shattered above them. Someone had thrown a heavy object through the upper window, severing the rope of the central chandelier. The iron frame crashed onto the table, scattering officers and servants. In the darkness, a man screamed. A pistol fired, and the smell of burning oil filled the room. Gideon pulled Eleanor behind a stone pillar as flames climbed the curtains. By the time the servants extinguished the fire, the evidence box had been broken open. The oilskin papers, tide table, confession, threat, and forged ledger were ash. 1 copper token lay beneath the fallen chandelier, blackened but intact. The second had vanished. A constable was found unconscious near the rear door, wearing the gray-coated man's stolen cloak, making it appear that the fugitive from Calder Mill had entered with the officers. Vane immediately accused Thomas of arranging the attack. Thomas had been standing beside Eleanor when the lamps failed, but in the confusion, no crown officer admitted seeing him. Clore ordered the boy arrested and declared all testimony from Calder Mill compromised. The following afternoon, Gideon and Eleanor were summoned before a special public session of the Royal Provisioning Committee. The gallery was packed with peers, merchants, newspaper writers, and ladies eager to witness Eleanor's second humiliation in 2 days. Lord Halstead appeared for the first time since abandoning her. He entered on the arm of Lady Celeste Marlowe, a wealthy widow dressed in crimson silk, and took a seat behind Vane. Halstead looked pale but composed. When asked why he had fled his wedding, he claimed he had discovered Eleanor's treason that morning and left in horror. He admitted writing the letters found at Belgrave Square, but insisted they were responses to Eleanor's attempts to recruit him. His testimony transformed him from coward into patriot. Vane then presented the token-making die and explained that only 17 copper tallies had ever been struck. Eleanor had supposedly created them to divide profits among her conspirators. The remaining token was displayed as proof. Sir Matthew asked Gideon to denounce Eleanor publicly and reclaim his committee seat. If he refused, his estate accounts would be frozen pending investigation, leaving thousands of Blackwood tenants without winter funds. Gideon rose before the crowded chamber. Lady Eleanor warned us about Calder Mill when every official in this room dismissed her. She entered a flooded tunnel to save grain purchased by a government that now calls her a thief. I will not preserve my office by repeating a lie. He removed the committee ribbon from his coat and placed it on the table. He also offered his London house as bond for Thomas's release and pledged his personal fortune to supply the northern villages while the Blackwood accounts remained frozen. The sacrifice silenced even the gallery, but it did not defeat the accusation. Clore suspended Gideon from the committee, ordered Eleanor confined at Belgrave Square, and declared Vane temporary administrator of the Blackwood commercial estates. Halstead left the chamber applauded by men who had mocked him the day before. Outside, crowds shouted Eleanor's name with hatred. By evening, Vale and Company's creditors had petitioned for seizure, Gideon had lost control of his wharves, and Thomas remained in prison because Clore refused to accept the bond until morning. Eleanor sat in her father's dark library with the surviving copper token before her. Every document had burned. Every witness had been discredited. The public believed the conspiracy solved. She turned Vane's testimony over in her mind. Only 17 copper tallies had ever been struck. That sentence contained the arrogance of a man certain he had destroyed every contrary record. Yet Vane had claimed he knew nothing about the serpent tokens before the die was found. A metal die could show the design, but it could not reveal how many tokens had been struck. Only the person who commissioned or counted them could know there were 17. More importantly, the soot-blackened token on the table bore the number 17 itself. If each investor possessed a share verified by a matched pair, the conspirators would believe Eleanor still lacked the master tally that authenticated all 17 payments. She looked at Gideon. "We cannot prove the 18th token exists," he said, understanding her thought. "It does not need to exist. Vane only needs to believe we found it before the fire." Eleanor took a clean sheet of paper and began writing a false inventory in the same careful form Clore's clerk had used. It stated that a silver master token numbered 0 had been removed from the evidence box and secured elsewhere before the chandelier fell. "We allow this to reach Vane," she said, "then announce that the master token will be authenticated at the full committee hearing in 48 hours. Gideon studied her face. "He will try to steal it." "No, a cautious man would steal it. Vane has spent 12 years convincing you that only he can repair every disaster. He will produce evidence proving our token false, and to do that, he must reveal knowledge no innocent estate agent could possess." Eleanor folded the invented inventory and sealed it. Their evidence was gone, their names were ruined, and their enemies controlled both companies. But for the first time, she did not intend to follow the conspirators' trail. She intended to create one and make them follow her. Before dawn, Gideon made 3 handwritten copies of the false inventory. One went to Sir Matthew Clore through an ordinary messenger, one was placed in a sealed packet addressed to the committee chairman, and the third was deliberately left inside the unlocked desk of the Blackwood estate office. Eleanor expected Vane's servants to search the office before breakfast. By noon, newspapers were reporting that a silver master token had survived the fire and would expose all 17 members of the grain conspiracy. The location of the supposed token was not published. Instead, Eleanor gave 3 different locations to 3 carefully chosen channels: the Bank of England in the note sent to Clore, the committee vault in the chairman's packet, and Nathaniel Vale's private safe in the paper left for Vane. Whichever location the conspirators attacked would reveal where their information came from. Gideon used the remaining hours to protect those they could not risk losing. His sister's carriage removed Nathaniel from Belgrave Square under a physician's supervision and carried him to a guarded Blackwood cottage outside London. Thomas was released after Gideon transferred the deed to Ashbourne House as bond, but rather than return to Richmond, the boy entered the committee building through a coal passage and remained with two magistrates' clerks who had witnessed the events at Calder Mill. Mrs. Mercer and Sir Rowland separately wrote accounts of finding the ciphered threat on Eleanor's veil. Each statement was sealed, copied, and placed with different solicitors. Gideon also located the clerk who had recorded the evidence before the chandelier fell. The clerk, Mr. Amos Reed, admitted that Sir Matthew had ordered him to remove two details from the public record. One token had been recovered at Storehouse 4 without a chain, while the second had arrived from Calder Mill, attached to a short copper chain with 3 flattened links. Reed had retained his original draft because clerks, as he nervously explained, trusted their first notes more than their superiors' corrections. Eleanor did not ask him to alter a word. The full Royal Provisioning Committee assembled 48 hours later in a chamber large enough to admit peers, merchants, magistrates, and newspaper correspondents. Sir Matthew sat at the center. Vane occupied the witness table, while Lord Halstead and Lady Celeste watched from the first gallery. Gideon entered without his committee ribbon and took a place among the public. Eleanor was brought in under formal guard. She wore plain gray, carried no papers, and walked to the accused position without looking toward the crowd. Vane attacked first. He presented a complete account of the conspiracy in which Eleanor had forged shipping orders, hidden grain on Blackwood property, recruited Thomas, manipulated Gideon, and arranged the Calder Mill fire to destroy her own records. His confidence was formidable, because nearly every fact was true, except for the person responsible. He knew where the grain had been stored, how the carts had been diverted, and why the false village sacks had been prepared. Each detail made him sound more credible to the committee, and gave Eleanor another piece of knowledge he should not possess. Halstead testified next. He claimed Eleanor showed him the grain routes on March 10th, and first mentioned Calder Mill 2 days later. Eleanor asked the chairman's permission to pose one question. "My lord, on what date did you leave England?" Halstead hesitated. "March 8th. "And when did you return?" "Yesterday morning." "Then you could not have heard me mention Calder Mill on March 12th. I did not travel with you, and you have sworn you received no letters from me after March 8th. Halstead corrected himself, saying he had confused the dates. Eleanor did not argue. She allowed the contradiction to remain before the room. She next asked Vane when he learned of the winged serpent tokens, when the die was discovered at the Vale counting house. "Before that moment you had never seen one?" "Never. Yet at our earlier hearing, you testified that exactly 17 had been struck." Vane replied that the number appeared on an invoice found beside the die. "Where is that invoice?" "Destroyed in the fire at Ashbourne House." "Then you read it before the evidence box burned." "Naturally." Amos Reed rose from the clerk's bench. His original inventory showed that the token-making die and supposed invoice had never entered the evidence box. Vane had retained them personally. Sir Matthew attempted to interrupt, but the chairman ordered Reed to continue. The clerk confirmed that neither document had been shown to him before Vane publicly described the 17 tokens. The committee shifted from confidence to unease. Eleanor then asked why Storehouse 4 had been listed as vacant in every Blackwood rent book, while carts entered it for months. Vane blamed junior clerks. Gideon produced 7 quarterly ledgers signed by Vane himself. Each contained charges for repairs to the supposedly abandoned warehouse, new roof vents, reinforced flooring, and construction of an interior partition. Vane insisted the entries had been added after his signature. Eleanor pointed to the totals. If the charges were later additions, the arithmetic at the bottom of each page would be wrong. The sums balanced perfectly in Vane's own hand. He had approved the false wall without naming it. The committee chairman asked whether Eleanor possessed the silver master token promised in the newspapers. "No," she answered. A wave of laughter and anger moved through the gallery. Vane smiled for the first time. He accused her of inventing evidence to delay conviction and reached inside his coat. "I anticipated this final deception," he said. "Yesterday, my men searched Nathaniel Vale's private safe and recovered the object Lady Eleanor intended to present. He placed a copper token on the table. It bore the winged serpent, the number 17, a triangular notch, and a short chain with 3 flattened links. There was never a silver token, Vane declared. This counterfeit is the master she meant to use. Eleanor remained silent until the chairman asked how Vane had obtained authority to search Nathaniel's safe. Vane produced an order bearing Sir Matthew's signature. Clore went pale. The order authorized a search of the Bank of England deposit, not Belgrave Square. Vane had revealed that he received his information from the paper planted in the Blackwood estate office. More importantly, he had produced the token that disappeared during the fire. "Mr. Vane," Eleanor said, "you told this committee you found that object yesterday in my father's safe. Mr. Reed's private inventory states that the Calder Mill token entered Ashbourne House on the night of the fire attached to a chain with 3 flattened links. Either 2 identical tokens possess 2 identically damaged chains, or the object in your hand was stolen from the Crown's evidence box." Vane claimed Eleanor had manufactured a duplicate. Gideon then placed the soot-blackened surviving token beside it. The triangular notches aligned to form the narrow diamond Eleanor had discovered at Calder Hollow. Around them, the committee leaned forward. "Matching notches can also be forged," Vane said, though his confidence had begun to fray. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, "which is why the notches are not the authentication." She called Thomas Bell into the chamber. The boy carried the torn section of gray wool from the fugitive's coat and a tiny copper ring he had found caught in its lining after the fight at Calder Mill. Until that moment, neither Eleanor nor Gideon had publicly revealed that a segment of the token's chain had broken during the struggle. If the ring joined the 3 flattened links on Vane's token, it would establish that the object came from the gray-coated conspirator, passed into the evidence box, and later reached Vane's possession. Thomas approached the witness table. Vane stared at the tiny ring, then toward Halstead in the gallery. Eleanor saw the silent appeal pass between them. Halstead rose as if to leave, but the doors were already guarded. Thomas placed the broken ring beside the chain. The chairman summoned the committee clerk to perform the final fitting, while the entire chamber waited in absolute silence. The copper ring slid over the broken end of the chain and stopped precisely against the first flattened link. Its fractured edges met so perfectly that the join nearly disappeared. Mr. Reed recorded the fit, then passed the chain to 3 committee members, each of whom examined it beneath the chamber lamps. The conclusion could not be avoided. The token Vane claimed to have found in Nathaniel Vale's safe was the same token Thomas had torn from the gray-coated attacker at Calder Mill, the same token entered into the Crown's evidence box, and the same token stolen during the fire at Ashbourne House. Vane attempted to say that Eleanor had planted it in his office, but she reminded the committee that he had produced it from inside his own coat, and sworn under oath that his men recovered it from a private safe they possessed no valid authority to search. "You knew the token was missing from the evidence box?" Eleanor said. "You knew there were 17 shares before any invoice was shown. You knew the construction costs of the false wall at Storehouse 4 because you approved them. You knew the grain convoy had turned toward Calder Mill before the Duke returned to London, and you knew where to search for a master token that never existed because you read the false inventory left in the Blackwood estate office. An innocent agent might explain one of those facts. He cannot explain all of them." Vane looked toward Sir Matthew, but the commissioner lowered his eyes. He looked toward Halstead, who had begun moving toward the guarded doors. Eleanor then laid out the entire design. Vane had discovered years earlier that Gideon's wife forged the Blackwood seal to sell military horses. Instead of merely concealing her crime, he kept the copied seal and used Gideon's gratitude to gain control of the estate's warehouses, relay stations, and commercial accounts. When poor harvests drove grain prices upward, Vane organized 17 investors who would profit if Crown supplies disappeared and unrest spread through the northern counties. Lady Celeste financed the first purchases through her Calais banking house. Halstead joined because his estates were drowning in gambling debt. He could provide what Vane lacked: access to Eleanor, Vale and Company's ships, Nathaniel's cipher, and a marriage settlement large enough to move thousands of pounds without immediate suspicion. For months, Halstead encouraged Eleanor to show him shipping maps and grain routes while pretending admiration for her intelligence. On the wedding morning, Rook used forged orders to transfer her dowry, then demanded a confession that would make her legally responsible for every shipment. The grain was never loaded onto the Mercy Jane or the other vessels. False manifests sent investigators toward France, while the sacks remained inside a Blackwood warehouse controlled by Vane. The empty village sacks would create records showing delivery. When hunger produced violence, Gideon would be accused of selling crown grain and abandoning his tenants. Eleanor was targeted, not because she was weak, but because her competence made her the perfect false culprit. She possessed the knowledge required to carry out every step, while society's contempt for an abandoned bride made her easy to disbelieve. Halstead did not flee because he discovered treason, Eleanor said. He fled because the marriage settlement had already given him access to my dowry, and marrying me would leave him beside the one person capable of recognizing the false cargo weights. Halstead shouted that she could prove none of it. Eleanor answered by asking him to explain the threat written in the private cipher she had taught only him and her father. Mrs. Mercer and Sir Rowland's separately sealed statements established that the threat existed before its destruction. Gideon testified that he saw the same cipher and red serpent seal. Thomas identified the gray-coated man as Captain Silas Ward, Halstead's former cavalry servant. One of the captured attackers had already named Ward as the man who delivered Vane's orders. The chairman ordered the immediate search of Vane's estate office, Halstead's London rooms, and Lady Celeste's Calais accounts. Vane finally broke, not from remorse, but from rage. He accused Halstead of losing his nerve and leaving Eleanor alive when the original plan required her arrest before she could inspect the warehouse. Halstead answered that Vane had promised the forged confession would be enough. Their accusations confirmed the partnership before the entire chamber. By evening, investigators recovered the Vale brass stamping plate from a locked drawer in Vane's office, 12 additional paired tokens from his private strongbox, and payment instructions bearing Lady Celeste's banking code. Captain Ward was arrested at Dover while attempting to board a packet for France. The 17 investors were identified through the numbered tallies and matching transfers in the foreign account. Vane was convicted of treasonous fraud, attempted murder, arson, kidnapping, and theft from the crown. His property was seized to purchase grain for the villages he had tried to starve. Halstead lost his parliamentary privileges and the estates he had mortgaged to finance his share. He and Rook received long prison sentences for forgery, conspiracy, and the attempted framing of Eleanor and Nathaniel. Lady Celeste escaped imprisonment by surrendering the foreign account books and testifying against the others, but she lost her fortune and was barred from serving as trustee or director of any charitable or commercial estate. Sir Matthew Clore was found negligent rather than part of the 17. His suppression of Reed's original inventory had allowed the evidence theft to succeed, and he resigned from the grain office in disgrace. Thomas received the crown reward offered for information leading to recovery of the grain. Eleanor required that part of it be placed in trust for his mother and sisters. The remainder allowed him to become a full partner in Vale and Company when he reached 21. The committee restored Nathaniel's company, canceled every fraudulent debt created through the marriage settlement, and publicly declared Eleanor innocent. More importantly, it credited her by name with recovering the grain and preventing the deaths at Calder Hollow. When the chairman offered Gideon his committee seat again, he accepted only after Eleanor was appointed independent comptroller of the new Northern Provisioning Board, with authority over inspections, warehouses, and distribution records. No man could remove her without a recorded vote. Weeks later, Gideon stood beside Eleanor in Storehouse 4, where the false wall had been torn down and the building converted into a public reserve granary. Sunlight entered through the repaired roof vents. Every sack carried 3 signatures, and every inventory existed in duplicate. Gideon returned the Blackwood signet to his finger only after handing Eleanor a separate key to the warehouse. "I owe you more than gratitude," he said. "I doubted you when the evidence was designed to exploit my fear. I placed you under guard without giving you the trust I demanded from you. I allowed my past to make your prison, and then called it protection." Eleanor listened without rescuing him from the discomfort of naming his wrongs. "What do you intend to do about it?" He gave her legal control over the warehouses used by the Provisioning Board, restored Vale and Company's access to Blackwood shipping routes without charge for 5 years, and placed Ashbourne House permanently beyond any claim connected to her father's debts. Only after those repairs were signed and witnessed did he speak of love. "I will not ask you to become responsible for healing what another woman broke in me," he said. I ask only whether I may stand beside you while I learn to become a man who does not confuse fear with judgment." Eleanor did not answer that day. Freedom that existed only long enough to accept a proposal was not freedom. She returned to her father's counting house, rebuilt the company, and spent the winter establishing honest grain stations throughout the north. Gideon did not pressure her. He worked beside her when invited, obeyed her authority inside the warehouses, and corrected publicly anyone who credited him with her achievements. By spring, Eleanor knew that what had grown between them was not gratitude born in danger. It was trust, built through choices repeated after the danger ended. Their wedding was small. At Eleanor's insistence, the marriage contract preserved her ownership of Vale and Company, her salary, and her independent legal authority. Gideon waited outside the church rather than at the altar. "Once we enter," he told her, "the main doors will remain open. If you change your mind at any moment, no one will stop you, and no one will blame you." Eleanor looked through those open doors toward the aisle, where a different man had once tried to erase her with a confession and a side entrance. Then she took Gideon's offered hand, not because she needed him to lead her, but because she had freely chosen the man who had learned to walk at her pace. They entered together through the main doors. The bells began to ring, and this time Eleanor did not hear them as an announcement that she belonged to a man. She heard them as proof that the woman London had tried to silence had returned in full view, carrying her own name, her own authority, and a love she had been entirely free to refuse.